Black Hills, Dakota Territory, October 1883. The sky was the color of a dull blade, and the wind had already begun to sharpen its edge on the granite peaks. For the people of Providence Gulch, it was the season of reckoning, a time to tally up the summer's gains and measure them against the winter's inevitable cost. For Alara Jensen, it was the day her world shrank to the size of a single wooden crate. Her landlord, Mr. Silas Croft, stood with his arms crossed, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He was not an unkind man, merely a practical one, and in this land, practicality was a virtue that often wore the mask of cruelty. "I'm sorry, Alara," he said, his voice as flat as the horizon. "The shack's been promised to the Miller boys. They can pay. They can work the claim." Alara said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had known this was coming since her husband, Lars, had succumbed to the consumption that had hollowed him out over the long, brutal winter before. Lars, with his clever hands and quiet mind, had been an asset. Alara, a widow with a strange Danish accent and no profitable skills to speak of, was a liability. A line item in the town's ledger of charity, and the ink was running dry. She finished packing the last of their meager belongings into the crate. Lars's worn, leather-bound journal filled with sketches of kilns and flues, a chipped porcelain cup he had made, a wool blanket, a small bag of flour, and a tinderbox. The town watched her go. They watched from behind the wavy glass of their cabin windows, from the doorways of the general store and the smithy. Their faces were a mixture of pity and relief. Every mouth was a burden, and hers was one they no longer had to consider feeding. She did not look at them. She fixed her eyes on the low, rolling hills to the east of the gulch, her shoulders set against the wind and the weight of their judgment. She was a ship cut from its mooring, cast into a cold and indifferent sea. She walked for 2 hours, following a deer trail that wound away from the sparse timberline and into the open, windswept country. The land was harsh, a rumpled blanket of frost-hardened soil, rock, and stubborn, low-growing scrub. It was here, in the curve of a hillside exposed to the southern sun, that she found it. It was little more than a scar in the earth, the collapsed entrance to an old prospector's dugout long abandoned. A tangle of thorny bushes grew over the caved-in opening, and a heap of weathered, forgotten timbers lay rotting nearby. Most would have seen a grave, a hole in the ground not worth a second glance. But Alara saw something else. She dropped her crate and knelt, pulling away the thorny branches with her bare, reddening hands. She scraped at the soil. It was not the loose, rocky dirt of the higher elevations. This was clay. A thick, heavy, reddish-brown clay that clung to her fingers. It was the color of life, the color of the bricks Lars had loved, the very substance of his art. That night, she huddled under her blanket in the shallow depression, the crate pulled close as a windbreak. The cold was a physical thing, a predator that gnawed at her bones. In the howling dark, with the stars like chips of ice overhead, she did not despair. Instead, she opened Lars's journal. She couldn't read his Danish words well. He had taught her to speak English, but her reading in their native tongue was poor. But she understood the drawings. She had watched him draw them 1,000 times by candlelight, his long fingers tracing lines of heat and air. They were not drawings of houses. They were diagrams of massive, subterranean kilns, the kind his family had built for generations back in Denmark to fire pottery to stoneware temperatures. These were structures designed not just to contain fire, but to master it, to hold its heat for days. He had explained it to her once, his voice raspy from his illness. "We do not just build an oven, Elara," he had whispered. "We build a lung for the fire. We make it breathe deep into the earth. We make the smoke pay rent before we let it go." A new idea, a desperate and radical seed, began to germinate in the frozen soil of her mind. She would not simply rebuild the dugout. She would not create a mere shelter. She would build a lung. She would make the earth breathe. She would construct a home based on the principles of a high-fire kiln, a place that didn't just fight the cold, but absorbed and tamed the heat. She started the next morning. Her tools were a prospector's abandoned spade with a cracked handle and her own 2 hands. The first task was to clear the collapsed entrance, a back-breaking labor of hauling away rock and frozen earth. By the end of the second day, she had opened a low, dark maw into the hillside. The inside was small, no more than 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a low, arched ceiling. It smelled of damp earth and disuse. This would be her living space. But it was only the beginning. Her real work, the work that would earn her the town's derision, began on the 3rd day. She did not expand the chamber. Instead, she began to dig a trench, starting from the back wall of the tiny cave. The trench was narrow, only a foot wide, and it snaked away from the chamber, running parallel to the face of the hill, deep underground. It was slow, torturous work. She filled a small bucket with clay and rock, dragged it to the entrance, dumped it, and returned to the suffocating darkness to dig again. Her hands bled. Her back screamed in protest. But every bucket of earth was a victory. She was not just digging a tunnel. She was sculpting a vessel for heat. This was the flue, the lung, the path where the smoke would be forced to travel, to linger, to surrender its warmth to the surrounding earth before it was allowed to escape. After a week, a rider from the gulch, checking his traps, saw the growing pile of reddish earth outside the hole. He watched her emerge, covered in dirt, her face grim with effort. The news spread through Providence Gulch like a contagion. The mad Danish widow was digging her own grave. They started calling it Jensen's Folly. The name was spoken with a shake of the head and a grim chuckle. It was a sad, strange story to tell around the fire in the evenings. A woman, broken by grief, had gone feral. She had rejected the company of men and God to burrow into the dirt like an animal. They pitied her, but it was a distant, condescending pity. She had become a cautionary tale. Thomas Blackwood heard the stories and frowned. He was the town's builder, a man who understood the logic of wood and stone. He had built nearly every cabin in the gulch, each one a testament to his skill. His joints were tight, his roofs were sound, and his fireplaces drew clean and strong. He believed in right angles, plumb lines, and the proven wisdom of generations. The idea of a woman living in a hole in the ground offended his craftsman's sensibilities. More than that, it worried him. She was a liability, and her inevitable demise would be a stain on the community. He rode out to the hill on a cold, gray afternoon. He found Alara on her knees, her arms deep in the trench, her face smeared with clay. The trench now extended nearly 20 feet from the back of her small chamber. She was lining it with flat stones she had painstakingly gathered from a nearby creek bed. "Mistress Jensen," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet landscape. He dismounted, his tall frame casting a long shadow over her work. Alara looked up, squinting against the pale light. She did not rise. "Mr. Blackwood." "What is this?" he asked, gesturing at the hole, the pile of earth, the scattered stones. It was not a question of genuine curiosity. It was an accusation. "The town is talking. They say you mean to live in here." "I do," she said simply, her voice low and even. She turned her attention back to fitting a stone into the wall of the trench. Blackwood's patience frayed. "This is madness. This is a coffin, not a home. The earth is a heat sink. It will leach every bit of warmth from your body. You'll be frozen solid by December. A log cabin, even a poorly built one, holds the heat of a fire. This will swallow it whole." He spoke with the unshakable confidence of an expert, a man who had never been proven wrong in his domain. Alara paused her work. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, were clear and steady. There was no madness in them, only a profound and weary certainty. "A sink can also be a source, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her English precise and careful. "The earth takes, yes, but it also holds. It depends on how you ask it." He stared at her, baffled by her cryptic words. He saw not a visionary, but a stubborn fool. "I am offering to help," he said, his tone softening slightly into one of a parent reasoning with a difficult child. "We can raise a small shelter for you near the town, a lean-to, something proper, something human." "This is proper," Alara replied, her gaze dropping back to her work. "It is human. It is just different." He was not wrong. He was simply incomplete. Thomas Blackwood understood houses as shells, as barriers against the cold. He saw a fire as a weapon, a constant, roaring assault needed to beat back the encroaching frost. His cabins were designed around this principle. They were wooden boxes, meticulously crafted, but boxes nonetheless. The central hearth, or stove, was the heart, and its purpose was to pump out heat as fast as possible. Because the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and the very air itself were constantly losing that heat to the outside world. A log wall, 12 inches thick, might seem substantial, but to the physics of cold, it was a sieve. Heat radiated through the wood. It was carried away by drafts through the smallest gaps in the chinking, and it rushed up the chimney in a torrent of wasted energy. A cabin in a Dakota winter was not a repository of warmth. It was a machine for burning wood. A machine that could never be turned off. To stop feeding the fire was to surrender. Alara Jensen, guided by the ghost of her husband and the ancient wisdom of kiln builders, was not building a shell. she was building a battery. Her design was an elegant inversion of the conventional logic. The central concept was thermal mass. Wood has very little of it. It heats up quickly and cools down just as fast. The earth, however, the dense, damp clay and rock of the hillside, possessed an immense capacity to store thermal energy. The problem, as Blackwood had correctly identified, was that the earth was a heat sink. Left to its own devices, it would draw the warmth from any object placed within it: a body, a fire, a life. Ilara's genius, borrowed from Lars, was in the how you ask it. She was not placing a fire in the earth. She was building a system to slowly and deliberately charge the earth with heat, turning its greatest liability into its most profound strength. The serpentine flue she was painstakingly constructing was the heart of this system. It was a hypocaust, a technology the Romans had understood 2,000 years before, but which had been forgotten in this land of abundant timber and hasty construction. Her small firebox, which she would build near the entrance of her living space, would not vent directly outside. Instead, its smoke and superheated gases would be drawn into the long, stone-lined tunnel. This tunnel, over 40 feet in length by the time she was done, would snake back and forth through the heart of the clay hillbank before finally terminating in a short, vertical chimney on the far side. As the hot gases traveled through this extended, subterranean labyrinth, they would be forced to slow down. Their velocity would decrease, and they would linger. During this forced journey, the heat would transfer, primarily through conduction, from the hot smoke to the cool stones of the flue, and from the stones into the vast surrounding mass of clay. The earth would soak up the energy like a sponge. The smoke, having paid its rent in the form of its thermal energy, would emerge from the final chimney as a cool, lazy wisp, its power spent. She was not just heating a room, she was heating a hill. The living space itself was merely the hollow center of this massive, low-temperature radiator. Once the surrounding earth was charged with warmth, it would radiate that heat back into the small chamber steadily and evenly, from all directions: the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It would not be the scorching, temporary heat of a wood stove, but a gentle, pervasive, and incredibly stable warmth, like being held in a cupped hand. The insulation was the hill itself. The thermal battery was the hill itself. The structure was the hill itself. Compared to Thomas Blackwood's cabin, the efficiency was staggering. In his house, perhaps 90% of the heat generated by his fire went straight up the chimney, a fleeting comfort lost to the winter sky. The remaining 10% fought a losing battle against the cold seeping through the walls. He had to burn wood constantly, a roaring fire, just to maintain a pocket of habitable air in the center of the room. Ilara, by contrast, would need only a small, hot fire for a few hours each day, a fire of brush, deadfall, even dried dung. This would be enough to charge the thermal battery. For the rest of the day and through the long, cold night, the hill would release its stored warmth, keeping her small home at a constant, comfortable temperature. She was creating a system that worked with the laws of nature, not in spite of them. She was making the cold irrelevant by making the warmth permanent. She finished in late November. The flue was complete, a hidden artery of stone buried in the earth. She had capped it with turf, so the ground above showed no sign of the work below. She built a small, efficient firebox of clay and rock just inside the entrance, and a sturdy door from the salvaged timbers. From the outside, it looked even more like a tomb than before. A low door set into a hillside, with a small, stone-capped chimney poking out of the ground some 50 feet away. It was unnatural. alien, an affront to the established order of things. The final nail in the coffin of Jensen's folly. The town had stopped talking about it. They had written her off. A tragedy, but one of her own making. The first snows came, dusting the hills in white. Ilara lit her first fire. She kept it small, feeding it scraps of wood she had gathered. For the first 2 days, the effect was negligible. The great mass of cold earth was drinking the heat, a thirsty giant. The air in her chamber remained damp and cold. Blackwood's words echoed in her mind. But she held her nerve. She trusted the drawings. She trusted Lars. On the 3rd day, she felt it. A subtle shift in the quality of the air. The deep, penetrating chill began to recede. She placed her hand on the clay wall, far from the firebox. It was no longer cold. It was not warm, not yet, but the icy bite was gone. The battery was beginning to charge. By the time winter arrived in earnest in mid-December, her home was a sanctuary. The walls radiated a gentle, constant warmth. The air was dry and still. A small, slow-burning fire for 3 hours in the morning and 3 in the evening was all it took. Her meager pile of scavenged firewood, which would not have lasted 2 days in a conventional cabin, now looked as if it might last the entire winter. She had done it. She had crawled into the earth and taught it how to be warm. January came in with a fury. It was not a storm, it was a siege. The old-timers would later speak of the winter of 1884 with a kind of reverence, the way soldiers speak of a battle that nearly claimed them all. A great blizzard, born in the Arctic, swept down the plains, a moving wall of white that erased the world. The temperature plummeted to 30, then 40 degrees below zero. The wind was a living monster, a shrieking, clawing entity that tested every nail, every log, every pane of glass in Providence Gulch. For Thomas Blackwood, it was a waking nightmare. His cabin, his pride, the finest structure in the gulch, became a prison of cold. The wind forced its way through infinitesimal cracks in the chinking, slicing through the air like razors. The single-pane windows were coated in a thick, opaque layer of frost. His family, his wife Mary and their 2 young sons, were huddled around the cast-iron stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The stove was glowing a dull red, devouring split oak logs at an astonishing rate. Yet 10 feet away from it, a mug of water left on the table froze solid. The cold was relentless, an invading army that could not be repelled. It crept up through the floorboards and down from the ceiling. The heat from the stove rose, hit the frigid ceiling, and fell back down as a cascade of cold air. They were living in a convection cell of their own making, roasted on one side and frozen on the other. On the 2nd day of the blizzard, Blackwood's woodpile, which he had thought would last until March, was half gone. He stared at it, a knot of cold fear tightening in his stomach. They were burning through their survival at a terrifying pace. The sound of the wind was the sound of their own dwindling time. He looked at his sons, their faces pale and pinched, their breath fogging in the frigid air of their own home. And for the first time in his life, he felt the icy touch of true despair. He had built a fortress, but the enemy was already inside the walls. 50 feet away from his house, in the smithy's barn, 2 of his neighbors' cows froze to death standing up. The town was shutting down, atomizing into individual cells of desperate survival, each family fighting a losing battle in their own wooden box. In the hill, Ilara Jensen sat on a low stool, mending a tear in her husband's old coat. The air around her was perfectly still. There was no wind here. The only sound was the soft, whisper-quiet hiss of the small fire in her firebox, a fire fed by a handful of dried sagebrush. The temperature in her subterranean room was a steady, comfortable 60 degrees. The clay walls, floor, and ceiling radiated a silent, unwavering warmth. It was not the oppressive, dry heat of an iron stove, but a gentle, humid warmth that felt alive, like the breath of a sleeping animal. She had no windows to frost over. The blizzard was an abstraction, a rumor she could barely hear as a faint, high-pitched whine at the edge of her consciousness. Her small store of food was safe. Her water barrel had a thin skim of ice on it in the mornings, but never froze solid. She was not merely surviving, she was comfortable. She moved about the small space with a calm, unhurried grace, her world reduced to a bubble of warmth and quiet security. She thought of the town, of the people huddled around their hungry fires, and she felt a pang of sorrow. But it was the detached sorrow one feels for those who have chosen a harder path. She had offered a different way, and they had called it folly. Now folly was a warm room, and wisdom was a frozen death. The blizzard raged for 4 days. On the 5th morning, the world was born anew into a profound and terrible silence. The wind had died. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The temperature, if it was possible, had fallen even further. It was a beautiful, lethal, crystalline world. In Providence Gulch, the chimneys smoked weakly. The fuel was almost gone. Thomas Blackwood burned a chair, then the small cradle his youngest son had outgrown. The acrid smoke of the varnish filled the cabin. He knew he had to do something. He had to check on his neighbors. He had to see who had survived. But first, a morbid, nagging curiosity pulled him in another direction. He had to see the widow's tomb. He had to confirm the tragic, inevitable outcome of her madness. He bundled himself in layers of wool and canvas and stepped out into a world that felt like another planet. The snow was waist deep, a fine, glittering powder that squeaked under his boots. The cold was so intense, it felt like a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his lungs. He struggled toward the hills, his mind filled with grim certainty. He would find her frozen, a monument to the folly of defying common sense. As he neared the hillside, he saw it, a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the small stone chimney that poked out of the snow-covered ground. It was not the thick, panicked plume of a desperate fire, but a calm, steady exhalation. He was confused. How could she have any fuel left? He pushed through the deep snow to the low door of her dugout. There were no footprints. She had been sealed in for days. He stood there for a long moment, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He raised a gloved hand and knocked on the rough-hewn wooden door. The sound was unnaturally loud in the frozen silence. He heard a stirring inside, and then the scrape of a wooden bar being lifted. The door swung inward. It was not a blast of cold, smoky air that greeted him. It was a gentle, silent wave of warmth. It washed over his frozen face, a soft, unbelievable caress. Ilara stood in the opening, her expression unreadable. She was not bundled in furs. She wore a simple wool dress. Her face was not pale or gaunt. There was a quiet calm in her eyes. Blackwood was speechless. He stared past her into the small, candlelit chamber. It was clean. It was orderly. It was warm. He could feel it on his skin, a deep, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very substance of the place. He took a hesitant step forward, crossing the threshold from his world of brutal cold into hers of impossible comfort. The air was fresh, without a hint of smoke. He reached out a hand, his fingers clumsy with cold, and touched the curved clay wall. He had expected it to be slick with condensation and as cold as a gravestone. It was not. It was dry and smooth, and it was radiating a distinct, gentle heat. It was like touching a living thing. In that moment, Thomas Blackwood's entire understanding of the world, of shelter, of fire and cold and the earth beneath his feet, was shattered. Everything he knew, everything he had built, everything he had believed with the absolute certainty of a master craftsman, was wrong. He had built boxes to keep the cold out. This woman had built a vessel to hold the warmth in. He looked from the warm wall to her face. His own was a mask of frost and confusion. He felt the sting of tears freezing in his eyelashes. His pride, his expertise, his identity. It all crumbled into dust in the face of this warm, silent, earthen room. He finally found his voice. It was a broken, ragged whisper, a sound torn from the deepest parts of him. The sound of a man whose world has been irrevocably upended. How? Ilara looked at him for a long moment. There was no triumph in her gaze, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, empathetic understanding. She saw not the arrogant skeptic who had lectured her, but a desperate man, a father afraid for his children. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to come further in. "The fire is a gift," she said softly, her Danish accent smoothing the edges of the words. "But we throw most of it away. I simply ask it to stay for a while." She gave him a cup of hot broth made from boiled roots. He drank it, the warmth spreading through his chest, a warmth that felt pale and fleeting compared to the deep, resonant heat of the room itself. He sat on a low stool, the one her husband had likely made, and he listened. She explained the principles, not with the language of physics, but with the simple metaphors Lars had used. Making the smoke pay rent, the earth as a battery, a lung for the fire. He began to understand. He saw the elegant, undeniable logic of it. A logic born not of fighting the winter, but of cooperating with the earth. He stayed for an hour. When he left, he was a different man. He returned to the gulch not as its foremost expert, but as a humbled student. He went first to his own home, where the last of the firewood was burning. He looked at his family, huddled and shivering, and then he began to speak, telling them of the miracle in the hill. The next day, a small procession of men, led by Thomas Blackwood, made their way through the snow to Ilara's door. They were the town's leaders, its patriarchs, its builders and providers. They came not to mock or to pity, but to learn. They stood awkwardly at her door, their hats in their hands, their breath pluming in the brutally cold air, waiting for the woman they had dismissed as a mad widow to teach them how to survive. Ilara shared her knowledge freely, without pride or recrimination. She took them inside, two at a time, into her warm sanctuary. She let them feel the walls. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, showing them the serpentine path of the flue, the importance of the draft, the concept of the thermal mass. Blackwood, his voice filled with a convert's zeal, helped translate her simple explanations into terms the other men could grasp. He was her first and most ardent apostle. That spring, the landscape around Providence Gulch began to change. Guided by Alara and engineered by Blackwood, the townspeople began to build. They did not abandon their log cabins, but they augmented them. They dug into the south-facing hillsides, creating new structures, part cabin, part dugout. They called them Jensen kilns, or earthen lodges. They learned the forgotten art of asking the earth to hold the heat. They learned that a small, slow fire could be more powerful than a roaring blaze. They learned that the most profound solutions are sometimes buried right beneath your feet. Alara Jensen never moved from her home in the hill. She lived out her days as a quiet, respected pillar of the community she had inadvertently saved. Travelers passing through the region in the decades that followed would note the unusual, efficient homes of Providence Gulch and the remarkable health and resilience of its people during the harshest winters. The method spread, adapted and modified, becoming a piece of the local wisdom. Alara kept her husband's journal for the rest of her life. On the inside cover, in his elegant script, was a single sentence she had asked him to write in English for her long ago. It was the core of his philosophy, the principle she had embodied, the lesson she had taught a town on the brink of extinction. It read, "Don't fight the cold, invite the warmth to stay." This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and their actions are a dramatic representation of principles of thermal mass heating. The content presented here is for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice. Always consult with qualified professionals for any building project. What about you? We are all, in some way, living in poorly insulated cabins, burning through our fuel, our energy, our attention, our passion, at an unsustainable rate. We are told to fight harder, to build thicker walls, to feed the fire. But what forgotten knowledge lies buried within you? What counterintuitive solution have you dismissed as folly? What hillside of your own potential have you been told is just a cold pile of dirt, when it is, in fact, a battery waiting to be charged? Your inheritance is there. The journal is written. The real work is not in fighting the cold outside, but in learning, finally, how to hold the warmth within.